everyone.
Love to hear that. Okay, so hello. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Alba Clevenger. I'm a master's student here at Concordia University in the Media Studies program, and I'm one of the organizers of the Situated Emergences Graduate Conference alongside Jen Boulay, Isabella Kosio-Bedoya, and Akira Oikawa. We are really proud of the work we've done over the last year to bring this conference together for you, and are really honored to present M. Murphy as our keynote. But first, we'd like to thank our funders, so Concordia University Graduate Student Association, the Applied AI Institute, Feminist Media Studio, Department of Communication Studies, and Concordia University Alumni Association. The Feminist Accessible Publishing, Communication, and Technology Speaker Series have been great partners in helping us bring Dr. Murphy here today. And would you like to talk about it? Okay,
Cool. Hi, everyone. So I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum. I'm a professor of feminist studies and social justice studies at McGill University and the organizer of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Tech Speaker and Workshop series, which seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. So I'm so excited to welcome you all to this partnered event, and this is our 101st event of the series. So for a few notes on accessibility, as is the case with all of our hybrid and virtual events, we have cart captioning in English, tonight provided by our captioner, Abby. So for folks on Zoom, you can turn on at the bottom of your screen. The captions aren't projecting right now, but all of you were sent the Zoom webinar link as well, so you can look on your personal device if the captions are useful to you there. We have two, tonight we have, or I guess it's afternoon, today we have a Q&A option available. So for folks in the room, you'll be able to raise your hand and Dr. Murphy will be able to answer them. For folks that are on Zoom throughout the event, you can type your questions into the Q&A and answer box, and there will be some time during the second part for Dr. Murphy to answer them. So we'll kind of go back and forth between the in-person and online questions. And if you feel more comfortable typing your questions as well, feel free to do that. It'll just be me reading them aloud. So yeah. And we have two other upcoming events this semester, all are hybrid or virtual. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of our past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. That's the redirect URL. The other one's way too long to remember, so disruptingdisruptions.com. Okay, go for it.
Nice. Okay, so those of us here at Concordia University's downtown campus are standing on unceded Ganyongahaga territory known as Jojage. Mohawk matriarchs and activists have much to teach us about what it means to recognize colonial realities on these lands and forge relationships based on solidarity and reciprocity. I'm thinking particularly here about the Mohawk Mothers and Ellen Gabriel, who is coincidentally launching a book on Thursday. So we remain hopeful about creating accessible and interdisciplinary spaces of anti, post, and decolonial study within these academic institutions, while remembering that our histories follow us and our actions will always speak louder than our words. With that in mind, I introduce our speaker. Murphy is an anti-colonial feminist science and technology studies scholar. They are a professor of the School of Environment and WGSI, as well as Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Environmental Data Justice and Science and Technology Studies at the University of Toronto. They co-direct the Technoscience Research Unit and its Indigenous Environmental Data Justice Lab, as well as the recent Indigenous Science, Technology, and Environment Research Hub. They are the lead social science PI in the Acceleration Consortium's CFREF grant, with a focus on Indigenous approaches to ethical substance. They are the author of the Economization of Life, Seizing the Means of Reproduction, Sick Building Syndrome and the Politics of Uncertainty, as well as the forthcoming co-authored Fear of a Dead White Planet, all published with Duke University Press. They are a Red River Métis from Winnipeg. Please join us in welcoming Murphy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alba. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, all the situated emergencies. When I first thought it was said situated emergencies, which also made sense. Thank you to the folks doing CART and everyone for coming out on a Friday evening. I'm deeply honored. So today I'm going to be speaking about birdsong, which is one of my new not new kind of obsessions, and place thought in the aftermath, particularly building on some of the work we do in our Indigenous Environmental Data Justice Lab. Okay. So just to say a little bit about who I am, as Alba said, I'm a citizen of the Red River Métis. And these days, I kind of like to remind folks that my community took up armed resistance when settler colonialism, really in the form of British colonialism, arrived. And so the British colonists came and made that survey up there on the top corner that, you know, marked where my family and other families lived. And that was the spur to beginning taking up armed resistance. And if you look kind of down here on this recent Google map, the orange is where the surveyors said we lived, and the yellow is where my family still lives. But now it's Winnipeg, there's an Esso gas station, you know, there's a corner store, there's condos. And there I am with my parents. We are on the last bit of land that wasn't covered before COVID, before they built a condo on it. And we went there and kind of did some practices and dug up some dirt and put it in jars and so on. So this is where I'm from. And I've been living in Toronto for quite a while now, 20 years. And one of the things that I'm most proud of my time there is the forming of this Indigenous Environmental Data Justice Lab. So some of what I'm talking about today comes out of this lab. This lab is a combination of academics and community researchers. So I co-run it with the person to the left in the delightful yellow sweater, Vanessa Gray, who's Anishinaabe from Aamjiwnaang First Nation, Beezy Gray, also from Aamjiwnaang First Nation, Kristen Boss, co-director of the TRU, and Fernanda Yankapaxi, who was our lab manager for a long time and is now a research fellow. And most of our work concerns this place, Chemical Valley, Ontario's Chemical Valley, where 40% of Canada's petrochemicals are refined. And give you a little drone action. Canada's Chemical Valley has some 50, matters how you count them, 57, 62 petrochemical facilities, all interconnected. That is all on the territory of Aamjiwnaang First Nation. The emissions of Chemical Valley, even as recently as this spring, when they declared a state of emergency for key emissions like benzene, are regularly something like 100 times the threshold level. So it's a place, a real hotspot of pollution, and it's a place where the community has really spent over 150 years battling the emergence of petrochemical capitalism as a form of colonialism. So there's a tremendous amount of wisdom that comes from Aamjiwnaang. So today I'm also thinking with birdsong. And this is, I kind of started to think about this in relation to the scientist, Sarah de Leon, who was working at Cornell's ornithology lab. And anyone who's a little bit nerdy about birds knows that Cornell's ornithology lab is the place. And Sarah de Leon started to do this study recording bird songs in the Hudson's Valley, which is also a place where there's been a lot of industrial pollution. And she began to document that bird song for chickadees changed in relationship to their exposure of polychlorinated biphenyls, which is a persistent organic pollutant that operates as an endocrine disruptor and does a lot of things to a lot of different kinds of organisms, but it changes the song of chickadees. So this is chickadee song with PCB in the mix. This is, it's not just chickadees, sparrows, starlings, blackbirds, any ubiquitous bird that you find around that likes to live in our urban spaces, or you can see persisting in agricultural fields that use a lot of chemicals, or around industrial spots, may have the same phenomenon. I'm really curious to see if someone wants to do work on pigeons. With the song sparrows, likewise, their song changes. And the important thing to note that comes out of this research is often what happens is their songs become more varied. And fascinatingly, when their songs become more varied, we might think, oh, they might not recognize one another and so on. But actually, they often find each other more attractive. And the songs, the birds that have the more varied, longer songs are often most lucky in love. And so I'm going to return to this point, but this is an important story for me to start with, thinking about what does it mean to live as a being profoundly altered by the chemical violence of colonialism. So Chemical Valley, which is the star to the left, is there on the Great Lakes. We are, I guess, up on the St. Lawrence Seaway. The star on the right is the place that geologists have decided or proposed to be the marker of the Anthropocene. So the two places are about 3 hours from one another, and they're all underneath the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty, which I'm hoping people of Montreal know is a covenant between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee in how to live peaceably and intergenerationally on these amazing waters. And so it rules the area of Chemical Valley. And so the golden spike here that is in this lake that is supposed to mark the Anthropocene. Actually, the most interesting thing about it, and Francis McCarthy from Brock is the professor who is doing this research, is that the core sample that they take to mark the Anthropocene, interestingly, has this color change on it. So when they talk about the Anthropocene, they tend to look at the industrialism in mid-century. They look at the explosion of nuclear bombs. So what this core sample actually shows is around 1867, a major color change, and that is the arrival of settler colonialism. So what I love about this site as a place to start talking about the Anthropocene is it physically and starkly shows that the arrival of settler colonialism is tremendously altering to the environment. And so part of what this core picks up is the history of this place, Chemical Valley. Chemical Valley is on the river between Huron to the north and Erie to the south. On the east side is Canada. On the west side is the United States, or Michigan. And you can see where Aamjiwnaang is. And this is like a list of all the facilities on the Canadian side, all the facilities on the American side. If you go down, you hit Detroit. And if you look to the right, you can see a map that actually this whole territory before the arrival of settler colonialism was all Anishinaabe territory on both sides. But in the early 1850s, a colonial survey came. They learned that oil bubbles up from the ground, and this area became actually the first commercial oil fields in the world. So this kind of well, the advent of the modern well, comes from Ontario. It comes from this neighborhood. And you can imagine speculators came by the hundreds doing these kinds of wells, grabbing the land. And by 1902, this is what like wells look like. And more oil sprayed in the air, on the soil, in the water, or on my computer, then I'm just going to move my computer a little bit so it's not sitting on a table. Excuse me. Then made it into a barrel. So you can imagine the level of damage that happened if this started in 1850. And one of the things we are obsessed with in our lab is this place. This is the Imperial Oil Refinery. It is, we believe, the oldest running refinery in the world. First started in 1870. So it's been, so once they started pulling out the oil, and you can see in this map from 1873, on the very right, you can see the Dominion Oil Refinery. That's what became the Imperial Oil Refinery. You can see the establishment of the railroad. You can see the beginning of property, and you can see the missions. So we see all the technologies, right, of colonialism. By 1897, this is what the refinery looked like, the first refinery. By 1898, it's bought by Standard Oil. Standard Oil is the company that became the emblem or the expression of the first form of a monopoly multinational, and it became ExxonMobil, right? The biggest oil company. So that's who owns this thing today. And we argue in our work, in our research, that really Chemical Valley is possible from a process of clearing the plain, like similar to clearing the plains. They had to do land theft. They had to make reserves. They had to have residential schools. It was a whole project to clear this territory to make it a place of petrochemical capitalism. And part of it was this kind of stuff of making property maps and making, creating all this paperwork of colonialism to justify property theft. So you can see the reserve and you can see the kind of taking of all the land that happened. By the 1980s, this is what Chemical Valley looks like. It's hundreds of pipelines of interlinked facilities. It gets put on the $10 bill as an expression of Canadian nationalism. So that's a little bit about where we work. I show this all the time. This is an important moment for our lab. We really came together around this. This is in February 2017, and it's a flare, a purported flare at the Imperial Oil Refinery. And the flare, well, do you think that looks like a flare? Right? It's like a fireball. But they called it a flare. And this is community members. This has been a recording from Vanessa Gray documenting. So flares, spills, accidents, unit upsets happen almost every day. But not every day like at this, that you can document it in the way that, you can catch like the police on a phone. So everyone was trying to catch this. This is what Imperial Oil said, right? They called it a grass fire. They said there was no issues with air quality detected on any of their monitors. There were no injuries. And this is the kind of information that Aamjiwnaang is offered. So BZ Gray, who was in that photo, beginning as a high school student, began to record each of these kinds of notifications that their community was given from these companies. And one of the things we did last year was many years of work, but it culminated in the release of this report with the Yellowhead Institute out of TMU called Data Colonialism in Canada's Chemical Valley. And it took a decade of that kind of information that BZ Gray gathered from being a youth, from being, I think they started when they were just like 15, 16 years old. And then another decade previously of handwritten data on the calendars. Industry comes into the community and hands out free calendars. So this is like Shell's calendar and like Imperial Oil's calendar. And so Ada Lockridge, who's a very important land defender from Aamjiwnaang, would document it by hand beginning in 2003. So we had data, community collected data from 2003 all the way to 2023. And from that, we did this analysis about the violence that is not called violence in Chemical Valley. And we showed how very few, only 20%, give you any detail about what's happening. Most of the announcements are, total gaslighting, like the one I showed you, or they might say something like unit process upset, Like, what does that mean? But we tried to find out as much as we could about each and give it categories that the community wanted. This is all community-based research. It all happens through a community review process at every stage. We built then also this mapping process that tried to take this bad data, this data filled with bad relations, and try to extract things that the community might want, and particularly which companies are most responsible. And so what we found was Shell's the #1 perpetrator, Imperial Oil, #2, Nova, Suncor, Ineos Solutions. Ineos Solutions is the one that caused a state of emergency in April. And moreover, the air monitoring system in Chemical Valley is controlled by an industry association. That industries association's board is Imperial Oil, Suncor, which is majority owned by the Royal Bank of Canada, Shell, Nova Chemicals, which is owned by Abu Dhabi, which is one of the world's biggest oil companies, and Arlangco, which is like a styrofoam kind of company, which is owned by Saudi Aramco. Also, I think they're #1 before Exxon. And these are really like top 10 perpetrators globally. So they're the ones kind of controlling monitoring in Chemical Valley. So in our lab, this is Indigenous environmental data justice, right? How do we take this data that is filled with these horrible relations, tie it back to this long history where we look at how the roads or the trails or the waters are renamed and made into colonial data, and try to figure out ways in which we can reappropriate it to our own ends and activate our own geographies. And so one of the important mantras of our work is reflected in this drawing by Mo Thunder, who's from Amjanong. It's titled "The Land Behind the Fence is Still Sacred." And this is kind of what's going to take us back to the birdsong. So we've learned all this like brutal history, but now how do we come at it in a different way that's not just a damage narrative? So some of the different work we do is reimagining pollution data. This is an example using the federal pollution data that is industry self-reporting, and the government collects it up. And that's our main source of data actually about pollution, is industry self-reporting. But what I want to show you is on this side. So we always think about values. We start with values, that's the roots, and then we grow up to the fruits. And this is a wild strawberry plant. But this is the kind of the place for reimagining data that the community process came up with, is these points, like the voice of the land is in our language. Traditional and ceremonial values are rooted in the land. The health of the land determines our responsibilities. We are here because of our ancestors. Living well with the land is our right and responsibility. So if we start with these kinds of values, then what is chemical pollution? And can we be rethinking chemical pollution, starting with our own understandings of land? So Anishinaabe, Métis, sometimes Haudenosaunee. And we draw on the work of Vanessa Watts, who's Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, professor at McMaster, amazing scholar, who offers us this idea of place thought as a way to describe a non-distinctive space where place and thought were never separated, because there never could or can be. Place thought is based upon the premise that land is alive and thinking. Land is not only alive, it's thinking, it's where thought is. And that humans and non-humans derive our agency through extensions of these thoughts. So another way to think about this is that we are manifestations of this greater thing we might call land, which encompasses in a kind of even bigger way all our relations. And so rather than a place-based kind of situating, like in a situated knowledge where you're kind of putting yourself in a set of relations that are physical and based in place, what does it mean to situate yourself in place thought, where you understand you are a manifestation of land in this way? So then what is land? Here, I want to help you try to unthink the Cartesianness of a situated approach, or a kind of mapping of place-based approach. So if we understand that we are manifestations of land or all our relations, there's a way of understanding the way that we are inside each other's life making. So Christy Belcourt kind of captures this well. This is like a well-known image that's used in many land defense marches. I'm sure it's used in Montreal too. But I want you to notice that it's a bird that the woman is birthing, that the water is moving through her and she's a manifestation of the water. Here again, this is the water has no flag. What is in what? It is not that you just eat the fish and it affects you, or you breathe the air and it affects you, but we actually are birthing one another in these relations. This is a non-heteronormative, non-human based understanding of reproduction and where we come from. Moreover, it's not just that thought comes from land, but law comes from land. Law is not human based in this way. And so non-humans have agreements and laws between them, and thought and thinking. And so here's another image by her, the earth is our government. So it's not just like people are in the center of this story. So here we have Turtle Woman giving birth to beaver, giving birth, kind of taking in the fish, interacting with the kelp, and so on. So you can begin with this non-Cartesian understanding of how we are entangled in each other's life possibilities and life becomings. And it's, to me, this is very queer. And we can extend it, right, through environmental justice and things like this very important report, Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies, and understand that these non-Cartesian relations in the disruption and aftermath of colonialism includes things like property, like technology, like fracking, like pipelines. And this is a work of Erin Coswell, who's also one of our lab members. So let's get back to birds and trying to understand this bird song. So one of the things about birds, and why I like thinking about them in relationship to this, is when animals are affected by endocrine disrupting chemicals, a lot of the science that is interested in investigating the effects gets obsessed with their genitals. But birds do not have, this is new, maybe this might be news to people, do not have penises. They've got holes. They've got cloacas, and the holes do everything. And when they have sex, it's hole on hole action. And so birds are also, I mean, I'm going to reveal myself, they're beautiful. They are gorgeous. This is not a functionalist being. This is a being that is becoming through desire. Right? It's becoming through desire. When they sing, they're not just singing in a functional way. They are beings that are really into beauty. And also it's amazing. Like if you go bird watching, you'll see a tiny little bird and like 50 people will be standing there just to like get a glimpse. I mean, they're such attractors, right? So it's not just they're attracting each other, they attract others as well. They're so gorgeous. So birds and other animals, when they are exposed to endocrine disrupting chemicals, like sometimes I like to say endocrine participating chemicals, like PCBs, they do have changes, right? They have changes in birdsong. They sometimes scientists really get in there and they're like, they have changes in their foaming, you know, in their holes and stuff like that. But it's also the case that we have all sorts of internal and external exposures that shape our, we could say, beautiful sexual becomings. So on the one hand, we have our internal exposures, and we can think about these as being like the hormones and stuff that we have in our bodies. And some of these are, I would say almost all of them are non-consensual. They are exposures we're stuck with because of some form that we're born in. They are exposures often like cortisol that comes from living in a stressed out, violent zone. So our internal exposures that shape our becoming, the bird and the bird song, are us, are not sites of liberal choice at all. And the external exposures are overwhelmingly also not of our choice. We are all here full of BPA, by bisphenol. And we actually metabolize it in a day, but yet we all have it because it's airborne. So people worry like, oh, my water bottle has bisphenol A. No, it's actually airborne. Like we all have it in us. It's almost universal. PCB universal. So, and these are just some examples. Like we are not in a choiceful hormonal state whatsoever. And then there's a few times when we can actually choose, like we can decide to take tea. So there's like a tiny sliver of play, of choiceful play or gentle play amidst all this other stuff. And so I'm trying to wrestle with this in the face of our becoming in this aftermath, in which our zone of choiceful play is very small amidst all our becomings. So our desirous becomings and all these becomings in the aftermath of colonial racial capitalism. So by Alterlife, I'm trying to think about the ways that we are forms of life caught up in each other's killings. And we're caught up in each other's livings. We are making and becoming one another. And for me, Alterlife is the state of being already altered, but life open to alteration. This brings us back to the land behind the fence is still sacred. What does it mean to come to our altered beings with a sense of the possibility of our becoming through desire, even in after it all? And so for me, this way of thinking also, to me, is a very anti-colonial way of thinking, as well as a queer way of thinking. And I really look to try to think about how do you do an anti-colonial science and technology studies. I often turn to Fanon. Even if you read like Wretched of the Earth, everyone right now wants to read the essay on violence. Well, the whole last part is clinical case studies. It is a science studies document. Anyways, so in this, he writes about, I should constantly remind myself that the real leap consists in introducing invention into existence, right? We are still open to alteration. In the world in which I travel, I am endlessly creating myself, and it is by going beyond the historical instrumental hypothesis that I will initiate my cycle of freedom. So it's in this spirit that I'm trying to think with birdsong. So I'm looking at time. I think I'm doing okay. Okay. So of course, I'm going to get a little more nerdy with you about chemicals in this way of thinking, and turn to thinking about polychlorinated biphenyls. So this, when we think of a chemical, we often think of it in this way, like a molecule in a structural diagram. That's what were taught in your chemistry class, your biology class. This is like, if you look up on PubChem, this is what it will look like. I call this chemicals in white space on purpose. It's not just that it's always on white space, but it's a version of substance without relation. Like what could be more white? And so what would it mean to have an understanding of chemicals or substance through place thought? That what I just kind of walked you through. This understand that land is alive, this non-Cartesian thinking. And to understand that substance and chemicals have extensive relations and responsibilities. So the first point is that if we think this way, chemicals are not small. We're taught chemicals are tiny and hard to see. But what I want to invite you to see is like, just look at everything. It is large in everything. It is infrastructural. There's nothing small about it. And even if you go to Chemical Valley and you look at a smoke plume, there is nothing small about it. It's infrastructural. It's not accidental. These chairs were, that fabric was made by Monsanto in 1972 or something. There's nothing, there's very little accidental about our chemical infrastructures. But because we're in it together and we're in these relations, these non-Cartesian becomings, we are in these forms of chemical kinship. The idea of chemical kinship comes from the work of Vanessa Agard Jones. People often use it as like thinking about we're in happy solidarity in our exposure. But actually, she develops this concept to talk about in Martinique, how Black plantation workers and white plantation owners in the contemporary, right, who've been involved in a long history of a relation of anti-Black violence and slavery, are stuck in a violent kinship. It's like kinship, I'm sure people in the room knows, it's not like our family's always like not killing us. So chemical kinship is full of this also the way we make each other's lives possible, the way we make each other's killings possible. So this polychlorinated biphenyls. Polychlorinated biphenyls is a product. Why is it a product? It's not flammable. It's really hard to catch fire. So you use it as a coolant in all sorts of things that get hot. They are in many, many things. And they were first produced here in Anniston, Alabama. And Elaine Sperry has done amazing work on the history of this place called Baptized in PCBs. It was a reconstruction project to employ emancipated Black workers and industrialism. But it's owned by our favorite company, well, after ExxonMobil, Monsanto. And so this is their product. This is their product. And if you look around a place like Montreal and you see this kind of thing, PCBs are all over the place. They're in all the transformers. They're grandfathered in. So PCBs were made, they're one of the only and one of the first chemicals to be banned in the late 1970s, early 1980s, but they're still grandfathered in our infrastructure. But PCBs have many, many forms. They're not just one thing. And even the different, what's called congeners of PCBs, make different kinds of birdsong. That's how wild it is. But, we all have it. This is from Canada's biomonitoring project that they did. We've all got these congeners in us. We also all got flame retardants in us. We could go on, we all got lead in us. Like everyone alive. And I think every being alive has PCBs in it. So we all are relatives of Monsanto. Anyways, and PCBs, one of the things about them that's like, is that they are shaped a lot like your thyroid. So they do lots of things to you. They're part of you in complicated ways, not just in terms of sexual becoming. So PCBs are all over the Great Lakes. If we think about the southern part of the Great Lakes, the United States part being a huge part of the industrial Rust Belt from the era, if you think about Detroit and the formation of petrochemical capitalism, this was a place where PCBs were everywhere. And so we can really see the density of PCBs in lake sediment. But at this point, PCBs are actually airborne. They travel the globe in clouds. And we're at the point where the majority of new PCBs come to the lakes by the air. So, surprise, surprise, PCBs also stick to certain things. PCBs like dust. They like microplastics. So microplastics are in some ways not so harmful in and of themselves. They're harmful because PCBs stick to them. They are in the turtles, they're in the fish, like pretty well in the 1990s, there was a whole period of documenting every kind of animal you could think of living being on the Great Lakes has significant members of PCBs. But fascinatingly, and this is work by my colleague Miriam Diamond, in the Toronto area, the greatest concentration of PCBs is in the financial district. Because you got to keep all those high rises cool. And of course, the most famous of these high rises are the TD Bank towers. And TD Bank actually is a very old bank. It was started by Dominion Bank in 1871, grew up to be TD Bank. The president of TD Bank also founded Consumer Gas. Consumer Gas joined with Imperial Oil and formed Enbridge. So TD, Enbridge, Imperial Oil, Exxon are all in their becomings with one another. They are deeply kin. They make one another. They still do. And so I also think about this, not just these material becomings, but it's also finance capital is in us too at this point. So back to birdsong. These are the lessons, like how can we, on the one hand, pay attention to these violent infrastructures that make us, but also try to, in a more than pessimism mode of political, anti-colonial political organizing together, pay attention to the ways we might make alter life in our desire with one another. We can sing in even hotter ways. And this is the message. So other kind of folks that help me think this, Elizabeth Lepense, a Métis digital artist who does a lot of games. Maybe people heard in the news when her Thunderbird strike, a game about like Thunderbirds dropping lightning bolts on oil company equipment, she lives in Michigan, was accused of being like an encourager of terrorism. But anyway, she has a whole series about thinking about what does it mean to toggle between this past and this future in the aftermath of the Great Lakes, memories of the future, and thinking about our kind of embodiments. And there's lots of different prophecies and stories about like, what does it mean to become a different kind of people as we work our way through the generations of dealing with colonialism. I really like this piece, which is of the people who sing for the water. So like, how can not just the birds, but also ourselves become this other thing as we go through this process of more than pessimism becoming. Sorry. And then going back to the land is in our language, I think there's something here too about thinking about language and land, and also our representations and our work and its relationship to the as expressions of land. So I'm going to end with playing for you. We can all meditate once more on a chickadee song. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. There's a little puddle here.
Okay, I'll be on the lookout. Well, thank you so much for an amazing presentation. We're going to open it up for questions. For people on Zoom, you can write your questions in the Q&A box and I'll read them aloud. And for folks in the audience, Dr. Murphy will try to repeat them so they're picked up by the mic.
Oh, wait, can you say that again?
Oh, can you, when
I'm repeating
you're
questions?
repeating the question, like you can shorten it, but
Okay.
so the people on Zoom can.
Okay.
And then every once in a while I'll pop in. So we'll try to go back and forth, but so far there's none from Zoom. So.
That'll also be a comment.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about the community collected data as a method to decolonize the data measured by the dominant, like interface, those kind of thing. Do you think there's any way we can do it better in the future and make like more mainstream and get some power to against those colonized data collection?
Because I want to try to repeat that. There's a question about our community collected data and what can maybe be learned from that to build different kinds of data collection against these colonial data formations. Am I kind of close? So one of the things about our lab is we do not collect data. So we know that universities love to study Indigenous people. Researchers come and go to Amjanong or Chemical Valley all the time. They extract stuff, they don't stay. We can look at cases like, I think people know about Grassy Narrows First Nation, and they'll come collect data and then they won't even tell you what the findings from your own bodies are. So we are not interested in really collecting data about Indigenous people or Indigenous community. We are an Indigenous-led group and community-led group who collects, who researches settler colonial activities. And these settler colonial activities can be in the university, so it might be something really close that a colleague's doing, but it's also what these companies are doing and what the state is doing. So, so this data that's collected is, they were collecting the announcements that the companies were offering the community. And then we're doing a critical analysis of what the companies were offering. That doesn't mean that communities don't want good air monitors that they have control of that work well. Of course they do. But our approach is to try to do these data evaluations from our own values and politics that attend to these two things. One, how is colonial forms of knowing producing the data? Let's expose that. The data is full of violence. Let's show how that works, and that's helpful to people, right? We're not using the data as evidence in that, oh, we're going to let the data be what counts as evidence that something is wrong. And then we try to reanimate it with Indigenous values. So it might be then reimagining another way to do data. It might be really honoring other forms of analysis that happen by the community. So this is kind of our approach. I can't say it's a universalizable approach, but I feel maybe one of the special things about it is really community members are full members of our lab. They're leads in our lab. They lead the work. And everything we do, we bring to community view. That means we put it up. We usually make printed paper. We put it up on the walls. We discuss and we follow how the community wants to analyze it. So this is a process that I think can be used in other zones, animating values that come out of other communities, but it wouldn't necessarily be the values that come out of these community views. So I think there's things to borrow or be inspired from and things to definitely leave that aren't for other people's taking. Like Anishinaabe values aren't for everybody. I don't know if that's helpful, but thank you. Yeah.
And following up on that point, working within the institution and with the organizations, getting funded for work.
Oh yeah.
Organizations, how has your or the unit's experience been? Because if you want some sort of documentation, right, when you receive funding, you ask your sort of information getting back, like where you use this funding or how those fundings are spent. So have you balanced that in your research unit? Like how much of what you share with those institutions?
That's a good question. So the Technoscience Research Unit is purposely designed in a way to self-govern itself on its own terms. So we have a whole process and we have a whole kind of lab manual that actually begins with our values, kind of like that poster for how we're going to operate, and we co-govern ourselves. And we really try to make a space in the university that has its own autonomy. And we do two kinds of research. We do research that's public facing, and we do a lot of stuff that's just for just community focused that we don't circulate. And there's lots of things we do that I don't share. It's not for me to share. It's like really. And so we have some stuff that we don't give to academia whatsoever. But, you know, even doing that report I showed, that was, I think, downloaded something like 50,000 times in the first 3 months. That's good number. U of T in the end is a neoliberal, valueless institution that does not care about content. It cares about audit. So we give good number. We work hard. We always have amazing researchers. We have full events full of people like this. We do reports that get downloaded. And so the provision of this kind of number is something that kind of helps to justify. At this point, I'm a very senior professor. So there's a way in which the institution, the labs, I run 3 different labs that I run, have a strong protection in them because of what you, so this question about like what are roles and responsibilities, this is one of my roles and responsibilities, is to create these spaces. I deal with a lot of the university and protect other people from it. But another of our work, like our work with the Acceleration Consortium on this big CFREF grant, which is like a $200 million grant, where we're trying to work with scientists, it's challenging at times because some scientists are really heartfelt and others are not as much so. And we do experience a lot of racism and sexism and homophobia. And I'm constantly trying to figure out how to design our interactions so they're harm reducing. But one of the things I'm kind of proud of is that we have, in this project, we've kind of forced this model that you have to start with values, which, you know, is unheard of in chemistry. Chemistry has never started with values. I can guarantee this, besides like IP, you know? And so, and then this process of making them listen to elders and making them like learn about Indigenous values and different teachings, making these value statements. We just had a workshop yesterday where we were like enshrining our values with all these scientists. Well, you know, I don't know how they're going to activate them. Like in a way, it's not for me to say, but those values also give us a power where we can say, oh, we're supposed to be behaving in this way. We're supposed to be behaving this way. And these are our governing forms, regardless of what the forms of the university say, how you're supposed to hold a meeting, or what research design is acceptable, or what the ethics board is willing to sign off on, or what the provost's office thinks is a good industrial partner. So these are some of the tactics. I'm not going to say that they work perfectly. They are, a lot of them, harm reducing tactics. You know, the university is a colonial place, so you're always going to be imperfectly manifesting and otherwise inside of it. But at the same time, it is a place where I think you can do that to some degree. So I'd say that's that kind of long-winded answer. In the back.
Really inspired by your work, thinking through about place thought.
Yes.
That become an act and an act of rethinking, like really fundamental concept. Like
Yes.
and me, I wanted to hear a bit more because in thinking about Alterlife, one of the things that resonates to me and I'm learning myself is with Anna Singh's idea of a latent common, or like how to be in the world that's imperfect and be together. And one of the terms that comes up to me is like commoning, ways of finding ways of living together. I wonder if you've encountered how a concept like place thought might replace a term like commoning or the common.
Yeah.
It has its own legacy in history. And I think the productive part of it, but there's also consequences to that. And I'm wondering if you've encountered that in your own work, how that might have a component in thinking through Alterlife.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to summarize that. I forgot to summarize the other one. The question is like thinking about commoning and Anna Singh's work on commoning and how that relates and is intention maybe to place thought and Alterlife. Yes, so I really, you know, I can appreciate commoning as coming from a radical European tradition. And when it lands on Indigenous territory, it doesn't work. right? Is basically, so then the question for me is like, how can we come into a conversation of solidarity across our different ways of manifesting, we could say anti-colonial, anti-racial capitalist land relations. So it's right to not want to appropriate place thought, but it's also right to then say, what is my roles and responsibilities given that place thought is actually the imminent jurisdiction of sovereignty on the territory that I'm working on. So that puts commoning in a different relation. And so rather than claiming commoning here, I would say for me, it's more about putting commoning as something that emerged from particular, we could say the place thought of another territory. And we can also even think like another kind of indigenous people. Thinking about that in a form of solidarity where we don't have to actually, like, I'm really not into universal concepts. I'm into, like, even in this theory of the chemical, I want to refuse a universal understanding of the chemical. I want to have a place-based or place thought version of our concepts that are values-based, that are related to our roles of responsibilities, that we don't appropriate from one another, but that we work to bring into solidarity with one another. It ain't easy. You know, but that's what makes a place like Women and Gender Studies really interesting. Or other kinds of spots in the university where this kind of question of like, can we actually like learn across our different epistemologies without like taking from each other? You know, it's not easy, but I think it's important. So I really appreciate that question. I thank you for it. Yeah.
Because I was reading this article within the same line, like basically comparing American soldiers serving in Iraq and then.
Can you talk a tiny bit louder?
Okay, so there, the article was talking about like American soldiers serving in Iraq, and then
Oh, yeah.
the chemical violence that was basically inflicted upon Iraq because of like what happened
Mm-hmm.
and the invasion. And at the same time, the author was talking about the reality of these soldiers, of the soldiers when they go back to the US and
The American soldiers.
exactly,
Mm-hmm.
and the regions where they are forced to live because of basically like economic situations, etc., etc., etc. And she's trying to create like this form of solidarity to like chemical exposure.
Mm-hmm.
The soldiers, like the case study that she took on both situations were like chemically heavily impacted regions.
Mm-hmm.
And then both of the two populations basically were ended up like having similar diseases, let's say that, because of chemical exposure.
Yeah.
And like her goal was like the author's goal was to create this kind of kinship and
Yeah.
between like the two groups.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that removes a lot of layers.
Yeah.
And power relations.
Yeah.
How can we avoid that?
Yeah.
Rising?
Well, this is why every time I talk about chemical kinship, I remind everyone about its origin, that it's not a warm fuzzy.
Yeah.
That kinship isn't necessarily warm fuzzy. And even if we think of like the model of a parent and a child, there is not the same roles and responsibilities. So again, I'm just going to this like roles and responsibilities. So if without really seriously understanding the differential roles and responsibilities as we are caught up in each other's killings in that story, then we're going to miss the opportunity for real solidarity. That would be my thinking about it. But I didn't summarize the question. The question was about chemical kinship and article that was thinking about people in Iraq who were exposed by military actions, and then American soldiers who are also exposed by those same military actions, and can we think of them in a kinship or a solidarity?
And there's still no questions from the online folks, but online folks, remember, you can write it in the Q&A box and I'll read it. So your questions will be represented.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Amazing job. I actually just wanted to ask you more about song, sensorially and also like moving question to the question of song and its transmissions and vibrations and possibilities.
Oh, can you say more what you're thinking?
I honestly don't know yet.
But like song in terms of that it's vibratory, it's not just
I'm sort of thinking like Dylan Robinson on song a little
Yeah.
bit, and being and epistemology and ontology. The possibility of song as law, the possibility of the very particularities of how song may be inherited or not. And then thinking also about song in relationship to another epistemology, for example, text and evidentiary.
right. So the question was about, can we think together more here about song in relationship to it being like vibratory, song as having epistemological forms, like can be in relationship to legal orders, communicative forms, and also in a contrast to the textual. And kind of get enough of it. So I'm gonna kind of stick to birds for a little bit. And like bird song, there's a lot of, because people are obsessed with birds, there is a lot of interesting research about bird songs. That bird song can be changes in bird song is quickly transmissible in a community can be quickly transmissible in a community of birds, as well as even like what we'd call like in human space, like transnationally, like it's amazing how transmittable change in song is. Song really changes in relationship to noise. So there are recordings of bird song from places before industrialism, and then industrialism comes, and then the song is like kind of permanently different now. Song changes in relationship to noise in urban places. There are researchers who looked at song changing when during COVID and city places got quieter, song changed. Song also changes in relationship to light and dark. So there's a lot going on. I don't know if if you go birding with like really good, I'm not a good birder. I'm like a birder who's like, I have binoculars next to my desk. I look out the window and I'm like, it's a cardinal, I'm just like excited for whatever. But sometimes I go out and, I don't know what's like in Montreal, but in Toronto, a lot of places when you go out birding, it's basically like older people, elders, seniors, and queers. That is who's birding. It's like, it's a great place to meet people. And some of these birders are so amazing. And they can recognize the birds just by sound. And they know all the different calls. And they can actually understand this call means alert. This call means I'm trying to get your attention. This is my sexy call. This is, I can't do any of that, but they can recognize. And that, I think that's pretty interesting, that you could have people actually hearing the talk of birds in this way. And for me, what I think of it less as a relationship to the textual and more of a relationship to the way that scientists look at genitals and penises or papilla, urinary tracts, as the place to understand. And also they look at egg yolk, they look at egg production, they look at ovary, they look at sperm. And that work folds so easily into heteronormative sex panic. Like pretty well, it's like a given almost. It's like, it's a prescript by the very way they put together their research design, that like, that's the way to panic about it. And so what I like for me about thinking sonically with birdsong as opposed to with the obsession about genitals is that it allows, and because song is part of the many ways birds attract each other, they also do cool dances, they build cool things, they like have cool feathers, they like, you know, they fly in different ways, like they do lots of things to appeal to one another, which is also really fascinating. And so for me, it's like this queer workaround as a place to engage about sexual expression and desire and sexual difference, and that that's material because it is actually changed by PCBs, but without going into sex panic, and without kind of enshrining the penis as like the thing that is like one must worry about the most, right? And then I love that there's some other examples of this, like there's also some fish that are really successful that I get into, really thrive after having sexual expression changes in the face of extensive contaminants. And again, these tend to be the fishes that no one likes because they like the ones that like live in garbage and stuff. But I appreciate these, like I feel an affinity for these non-human beings who are figuring out ways to thrive in desire with one another in these spaces that we're also trying to like figure out how to thrive in desire with one another. So the song kind of gives me that. And that's about as far as I've gotten on it. But I thank you for that question. I'm sure there's so much more I could think if I was thinking with drama and performance.
I'm going to read one from online.
Great.
So Jared writes, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. Purely to get you to talk about birds more, how do researchers tell the difference between bird songs that change as a result of external stimuli and bird songs that change because of bird song change?
Right.
Sorry.
So I want to understand the question. How can they tell that it's from an external stimuli? Would a chemical count as an external stimuli, I guess is the question. Like, is the question about how do you tell if it's an external stimuli like change in light versus an internal stimuli like you've imbibed PCBs and it's part of your being? I'm just like trying to think about what is the
Jared added, because you mentioned that bird songs just change all the time.
They change, and they're also quite steady. They change all the time as they live in a changing world. There's a lot of this work that's documenting on PCBs. They actually, take blood samples from the birds and measure the PCB levels and are able to correlate down to the different congeners, the difference in song. So they have it's a correlative study, but nonetheless, and they're able to show that the song is different in PCB heavy places compared to if you go like in the same part, another part of New Jersey, for example, where there's not a heavy concentration of PCBs, where it's not in the bird's blood at that heavy level and they don't have that bird song. So that's how they set that up. They do have these big like microphones that they use. There's also some like land defense that happens with using bird songs to birdsong recordings in relationship to try to document the effects of logging, construction, and so on land relations. So people document this stuff in a birdsong change or birdsong volume or birdsong, like not volume, density, I guess, frequency of birdsong based on noise. So there's that kind of work that's part of the evidence that land defenders also use. So there's different kinds of research setups. And that's what I can kind of say about it. Hopefully that's helpful, Jared. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. My question is also about birds.
Yes.
I If I'm not mistaken, chickadees are not migratory birds. Are
Mhm.
they?
They stay here, yeah. They overwinter.
That's one of the questions, were more on this desiring on the land that is literally waiting.
Mhm. Yeah, they're interested in staying around.
Yeah, they're just staying around.
Mhm.
I'm interested in that.
Yeah, it's also like some birds really differ in I don't know what the technical word for it is, but like their startle reflex. And chickadees are famous for like landing on your hand, right? And like sparrows, starlings, blackbirds, the birds that scientists have been able to do these correlations with are birds that really hang out close to us too. And so they're also birds that are like really willing to live in tight proximity with us as well, which is also interesting. Like, even though we're like, I don't know, I was gonna like use a swear word, but like, even though we're real jerks, yeah, they still want to be around. And so that's also a kind of staying with, Harry would say staying with the trouble in some kind of way, but it's staying with. I appreciate that. Thank you. That was a great observation.
Thank you. This conversation about birds made me think about something recent that I really love. We talk about working with and against technoscience.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how you approach certain types of science to work with birds, as you just mentioned, but also reject others, as you just mentioned, and how you build, like constantly that difference, because I think that's something that has to be assessed and reassessed, and how you build that.
Yeah. So that's a great question. I wouldn't privilege Sarah de Leon's study over like observations by community members at Amjanong about changes in birdsong, for example. People notice a lot of things. There's a lot of noticing about fish in particular, but also like butterflies. We use the strawberry because people want to talk about what they've noticed about changes in wild strawberry. So I wouldn't privilege something like Sarah de Leon's work over other kinds of knowing about birdsong necessarily, or other people who are doing this kind of recording. The cool thing about a lot of ornithology is it verges on community science. Some kinds of there's other kinds of science that are like that. That's like that. Some kinds of plant-based science is like that. But the question about the colonial relations have to be asked for sure. So you have to be with and against in that way. And the whole thing is with and against, like just even being in the university is with and against, like the example of like trying to analyze the science together or the data together in a different way is that being with inside. We're doing it in our lab, we're doing it in a community review, but we're doing it with and we're doing it against. We believe ourselves to be ultimately for our own purposes, if you will. Yeah, so I don't necessarily I'm not the decider of the with and against always. It comes more out of, I would say, collective analysis.
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with Indigenous research methodologies. You mentioned, I don't know if I understood this correctly or not. You mentioned not wanting to appropriate place thought.
Yeah.
Now, does this mean that we cannot use this philosophy of thought, like this indigenous philosophy of thought, in other areas of research? If we can, how would that become possible?
So, well, first of all, I would love you to go read Vanessa Watts's article, Place Thought. It's very grounded in Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee creation stories and epistemologies. It is very specific. But it's also the case that Métis or Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee are the only people who have ontologies of what's alive or what makes up the world that don't match Western scientific ontologies of what's alive and what's not. The object world that I would say white supremacist knowledge gives us, most of the world has knowledges that work another way. So the invitation of place thought is not to take the specificities of it, but to be thinking about, is there a relationship to what is alive, a relationship to non-nation state, non-colonial forms of law and jurisdiction that might come from out of your place of being. It might become diasporically. It could come from a relationship as a settler that would pose a different kind of responsibility to you in relationship. But one of the things about what I think place thought is working against, and this might be what we share more than place thought itself, is that I would say that white supremacist colonial epistemologies offer us predominantly an understanding of a world filled with dead objects. And these objects that are understood to be not alive are then open to taking and destruction. And so to even then try to animate another kind of ontology that's against, I would say, the dead world, that's the invitation, but not necessarily take the specificities. So to be in solidarity with that project of being against the world of dead things. I don't know if that's helpful. The question was about appropriation and thinking about Indigenous research methodologies when you're not coming out of coming to it as an Indigenous person.
Maybe just to be mindful of time, and because we lose our captioner in 10 minutes.
Yes.
Maybe there's time for like one more question-ish. If there's like a question.
If that's the burning question, then.
Sorry, I just have one follow-up question on the last question. So what is the difference between place thought and localization of power?
Right. So place thought has an ontological commitment. Localization is just like, I'm here on a Cartesian map and I'm here and I'm going to still use like predominantly Western forms of cartography, or maybe it can be like relational thinking on a plane, on a Cartesian plane, to understand like what's in the world. I'm a big fan of the world of many worlds. So I would say like what, the kind of the approach of the world of many worlds is that Western science wants to, the idea of universal knowledge, where we can all be placed on a single map, is the world of one world. And we are invited to submit to the knowledge forms and the ontologies of a version of the world of one world that does not want the existence of other worlds. The world that allows a world of many worlds, a world that many worlds can fit in, is the world that allows that there might be many kinds of ontologies and epistemologies and worldings about what is here, and how do we work in solidarity to live together in a way that doesn't need to destroy one another in order to exist, like the world of one world. So colonial science is like such a manifestation of the world of one world. So maybe that's a little bit helpful.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our captioner, and thank you, Asli, for running the tech on the virtual side. And please come to more of our events, and congrats also to the successful conference as well at Concordia. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Métis.
Thank you, everybody.